Hey guys, these tires are from Proline. They are the BF Goodrich crawlers. I don't just have 2 of them, I have 4 of them and they're up for grabs. So subscribe to the channel, don't miss your chance on winning them, and to make it more interesting, write me a comment on why you need them and I'll put you into the final draw. So let's get back into today's video. And this week we are adding a flex kit onto the suspension of the TRX4. Only for the front because the rear is working quite well at the moment. Check out my other videos on that. How I put some shock towers in, play with lift kits and shock towers. I'll put a subscription down. No, put a link down into this description. Funny. So now we're going to concentrate on the front axle to get a bit more droop and a bit more articulation out of it. So the main problem on the front suspension is the panhard rod, which kind of limits your flexibility on the droop and also on the articulation a little bit. So with this kit, changes the geometry of the panhard rod bar. Panhard rod bar. No, just the panhard rod. Geez, how many times do I have to say this? So let's mount this 3D printed suspension flex kit. Not to be confused with anything else. It's just a flex kit. So how this is going to work, we're going to take out the shock tower, replace it with the flex kit. And as you can see, this one here has a mount for the panhard rod. So this is apparently where it changes the geometry so that we can get a bit more droop out of the front axle. So what I'm going to do, take out the shock absorbers. I'm just going to disconnect them quickly. Once I've disconnected them, I'm going to measure how much the axle droops down, and then by adjusting the panhard rod, remeasuring it, and then see how much more droop we get out of the axle. So a quick explanation, let me turn the car around. This is the panhard rod. Now it gets connected on the so-called left side of the truck, and it kind of limits the travel, the up and down travel on the front axle. If I were to take this out, the front axle would move a little bit more, but also the steering arm also limits the travel of the front axle. So by mounting the new mount, the geometry of the panhard rod bar changes. If I say bar one more time, you're going to actually just exit the video. So by mounting the flex kit, the geometry of the panhard rod changes. So we might have to adjust the length just a touch, and also the length of the steering arm, just to get a little bit more droop out of the front axle, and obviously also flexibility. So flexibility and articulation. So putting it back on the stand, centering my axle as far as it drops down or droops down, going to measure the center of the axle. And on this side, yes, we're about right. So at the moment, with the steering arm and the panhard rod limiting the droop of the suspension, I am on 6.4 centimeters. So from the table to the center of the axle is 6.4 centimeters. So I'm going to remove the original mount and replace it with a 3D printed flex kit. So I've got the original mount off, and now I just need to disconnect the panhard rod. So first I'm going to install the left side, and then I'm going to go over to the right side. So quick explanation where the panhard rod will sit now. Measuring the original, you can already see that the panhard rod is going to sit a lot lower. So let's measure that quickly. The original bracket from the corner of the chassis to the center is about 0.9 centimeters, so just under 1 centimeter. And in this case here, measuring from the bottom of the chassis bracket to the center is 1.7 centimeters. So 0.8 millimeters lower than the original mount. So I'm going to be using a bit of a longer bolt for that one because I've used up all of my long bolts. And I'm going to hook it up. So on the new bracket we have two holes where the shock absorber can be mounted. If I put the original bracket next to the new bracket, you can see that the top hole is the original mounting. We are going to install the shock absorber in the lower section. So everything is hooked up and installed. Let's measure the height to the front axle. Center of the axle on the left side and the center of the axle on the right side. We are now sitting by 5.5 centimeters. So before it was 6.4, now it is 5.5. So that means the axle has dropped by 0.9 millimeters, giving it a droop of almost 1 centimeter more. Whereby with the setup of the rear axle, we managed to get 1 centimeter more droop out of it. So it's a difference of 0.1, which I'm absolutely happy with. Now I'm just going to do some small adjustments onto the rods on the front axle to maybe get a little bit more play out of them. So on a full extension, the rods are all free, and compressing the suspension all the way, the rods are also free, having a lot of play. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the panhard rod out and extend it by just unthreading it. And the reason why I want to do that is I hope I can get this on camera, or as good as possible as on camera as I can. I'm actually going to swing the camera forward. So holding the camera at this angle, you can see that there's a slight difference between these two stabilizer rods. If I compress them, they kind of balance each other out. You can see it actually moves that way. So as I compress it, the axle, the entire axle actually moves a little bit in this direction. Very slight, but in a compressed form, the rods are perfectly parallel to each other, and in the full extended form, it travels over just a little bit to the left. And what I'm going to do is adjust the panhard rod and just give it about 0.2 millimeters more. So I'm going to unthread it by 0.2 millimeters, install it again, and see how the axle is behaving. I'm just going to take the rod out. Measure the distance. It is exactly 3.75, and I'm going to be extending it to 4. There, that's absolutely perfect. So by taking it out by just 2 windings, it will not make any difference to the stability of the rod. Now after adjusting the panhard rod, the 2 swing arms are now perfectly angled to each other. Just making sure the articulation is running as free and as easy as possible. So now what I'm going to do, put the tires back on and adjust the pressure load of the spring. So let's put the battery back in, that we've got the correct weight of the vehicle when it is driving. And I like my cars to just drop into the suspension as I let them go. This is happening a little bit now. I'm going to soften the spring load so that the car can drop a little bit further down, giving me a better center of gravity, but allowing the droop to give me more traction on the trail. What I'm going to do, I'm going to set my car exactly halfway so that I have 50% of droop and 50% of suspension compression. I just drop it, just checking if the car is sitting parallel to the ground. That's perfect. 100%. So now we have more droop and more articulation in the front suspension. So now, but comparing the view of the car, you can actually see that the front tires, while it is standing on the Traxxas stand, the front tires are actually touching the floor. Where before, the rear tires would touch and the front ones would be in the air. So now we've got all tires on the floor, changing the original brackets with the flex kit really makes a difference of almost 1 centimeter in droop on the front axle. So on the front axle, the setup is a little bit different because you have 3 rods that are limiting the articulation of the suspension. So anyway, this is how you can set up your front axle by just extending the panhard rod by about 2 to 3 millimeters and fitting the flex suspension system. So guess what? The steering's off. Obviously the steering's off because I just adjusted the panhard rod and not the steering rod. So I'm going to take the steering rod out quickly and just adjust it because I thought I'd get away with it by just using the trim, but it's adjusted, or put it this way, then you're on full trim to drive straight. So I don't want that. I want the trim to actually have a little bit of play into both directions. So I'm just going to adjust that steering rod quickly, also by probably about 4 millimeters, just lengthen it in itself, in its threads, which still gives it enough stability. So I'm going to set the steering trim to 0 and then adjust the steering arm. I'm just going to unscrew the steering link until it is about right. That should do the trick. So with this setting, I can trim it into both directions. So we still have perfect steering, which is the ace up the sleeve on the TRX4, guys. Don't forget that. You don't want to manipulate that. Jeez, I've been working up a sweat. Let's hit the trail. that's it for me this week, guys. Subscribe to the channel. Tell me why in the comment section, what do you need these tires for? And I'll put you into the final draw. See you next week. Bye.